Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar as part of NatCan's Child Protection Week webinar series. My name is Jamie Crosby. I'm your facilitator for today, and I'm quite honoured to be invited by NatCan to facilitate what will be a great and lively discussion amongst our panel members. Today's webinar is Partnering for Better Outcomes, and we'll have governance partners from Safe and Supported, the National Framework for Protecting Australia's Children, discussing their reflections and learnings on quite a distinct partnership approach that was adopted in the development of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and General Action Plans under Safe and Supported, and the learnings that can come from this type of approach in an effort to improve outcomes for children, young people and their families that are involved in the care and protection system. Hopefully, improvements that will lead to less children and young people coming to the attention of statutory authorities and being involved in child protection systems across the country. Could I acknowledge and extend my respects to the Larrakia people, the traditional owners and custodians of the lands and sea country on which I'm dialing into this webinar from today in Darwin. And I acknowledge the ongoing connection extending over 65,000 years of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across the Australian landmass and sea countries, and honour their ongoing legacy and their commitment to ensuring that culture, law, family and kinship works in harmony on the lands and sea country on which we're based. Thank you personally to the Larrakia elders for allowing me to tread lightly on your country this week over the next 5 days. And I've been fortunate enough to both have a quick walk around town and also dip my feet in the water. And as Jay Wilmer said yesterday afternoon at the Snake conference, went for a quick swim and still have both my feet. So that's a really good outcome in Darwin. Could I acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians and ancestors of First Nations communities across Australia? Particularly want to extend my acknowledgement and thanks to Paul Gray's participation in today's webinar, and acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander individuals who are participating in the webinar, not only today, but throughout the series that NatCan are offering this week. A little bit of housekeeping before I introduce the panel. So if you're not familiar with GoToWebinars, as you've logged in, there's a small dialog box that would have popped up on your right-hand side, and that's got all of your control functions in there. Everyone has been placed on mute throughout the panel discussions, and we're encouraging people to post questions through the chat function. Those questions that are posted throughout the discussion are being monitored by the great NatCan IT support team. They'll be consolidated and come through to me as the facilitator. So at no matter what stage you put your questions forward, they will be noted and we'll return to those at the appropriate time in the second half of our panel today. If you have any technical difficulties at all, please get in touch with the NatCan team, and the support contact details are on the webinar page off the NatCan site. And just a reminder for people that we are recording today's webinar, and NatCan intends to post all of the videos of the various webinars this week onto their website. So please be aware that you are being recorded, and the recording will be made public following the webinar series. If you're not comfortable with that, you're welcome to listen in to the webinar and not contribute through a question. But if you are uncomfortable about being recorded in any way, we just politely ask you to withdraw from the webinar at this stage to respect your wishes and privacy. As I said, my name is Jamie Crosby. I'm a dad with 2 young teenage boys. I'm a husband and have a wonderful partner, and I certainly married up in my circumstances. I'm about 6 foot tall and way too overweight for a guy in his early 50s, but please don't hold that against me. And during my day job, I'm the CEO at Families Australia, which is a national peak bodies for families. And through that role, I also convene the National Coalition on Child Safety and Wellbeing. And we're one of the governance partners involved in the Safe and Supported framework across the country. I'd like to take this opportunity at the moment to introduce our panel members, and we do have a great lineup of very learned and experienced people. In the first instance, could I introduce Paul Gray? Paul is a Wiradjuri man from New South Wales, and his day job, amongst other things, is being the Associate Professor of the Child Protection Research Hub at UTS. Paul has a very long involvement in child protection sector, including leading various strategy, advocacy and systems change initiatives through his work. As well as prior to being an academic, Paul has also worked in government and across Aboriginal peak organisations, and he's one of the people that has a very strong, visible and long-term commitment to improving the outcomes and experiences of First Nations children and family through his work efforts. So thank you for joining us today, Paul. I'd also like to introduce Helen Misson. Helen is currently the Acting Deputy Director General at Queensland Department of Child Safety, Seniors and Disability. Helen has extensive experience across the child and family sector, going back over 30 years, being involved in policy, program development and intergovernment relations, and has really been at the forefront, I think, from a Queensland perspective in particular, about thoroughly engaging in a systems change approach within a safe and supported context, and being open to being challenged about the way the government that she works for and governments more generally have done things in the past, and acknowledging that we need to do things in a different way into the future. And as a non-government person, it's been very refreshing to be involved in a process where there is that level of openness from jurisdictions to engage in the path that we've embarked on over the last couple of years. And our third panel member is Tim Crozier. Tim is the branch manager of Children's Policy Branch within the Department of Social Services at the Commonwealth level. Tim has worked in a variety of Australian and UK government departments across an extensive range of social policy areas, including social security, early childhood development and education, school and social exclusion. Whilst I have been a public servant for a brief period of time in a previous life, I have a 20-year plus career in the non-government sector, and Tim is one of those people that I do enjoy talking to and engaging with from a non-government perspective, because again, he's open to listening. He takes seriously the feedback and the information coming through to him from his stakeholders. And he's one of the people, I believe, at the Commonwealth level who has really championed the approach that's been adopted for Safe and Supported. And without the commitments of all three of our panel members and the influence that they bring through their work and the teams that they lead and their individual contributions to community, we wouldn't have set up Safe and Supported in the way that it has. So thank you to the three of you for joining us. And before I open the discussion and throw it to Tim, so that's your 30-second warning. The context of today's discussion is that we are in National Child Protection Week. And the NatCan theme for Child Protection Week is that every child in every community needs a fair go. And in particular this year, NatCan's sub-theme is where we start matters. Where we start in the way that we view children and families matters. Where we start when we consider the aspirations and desires and how we support families to achieve their goals matters. The political and social construct in which we operate, discrimination, access to resources, support and full inclusion amongst community life matters. And it's within that context that we're talking about the safe and supported partnership approach, which has been driven by commitments under the Closing the Gap agreement. It has seen governments and the community sector and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community sector work in a different way. And what do you know, the sky hasn't fallen in. We all acknowledge we need to do things differently than we have over the last 240 years since Europeans arrived to improve outcomes, particularly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the child protection system, but for all Australian children involved in the child protection system. I welcome the opportunity to have a discussion with our panel about their reflections and observations about what's been done differently in this approach, where they think some value has come from it. I'd also encourage Paul, Tim and Helen to consider any sort of personal learnings or reflections you have about the way in which your approach or behaviour as a leader within your communities and your work sectors may have influenced the way that you individually have approached situations or conversations. We will have a little bit we'll have individual opening remarks from all three panel members. Please post comments and questions through the chat function as we go. And then towards the end of the webinar, we will also open generally for an open plenary discussion. So thank you for joining us today. I look forward to the discussion ahead. And Tim, what have you thought about safe and supported? Having been involved in a range of negotiations, agreements, frameworks over your extensive career in government in a variety of areas, what struck you about safe and supported and the way that the partnership approach that's been adopted has influenced the development of the framework? And in opening your remarks, I wonder whether you could provide just a brief overview for our webinar participants on safe and supported in its own right.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. Hopefully everyone can hear me, and thank you also for those kind opening remarks. As Jamie said, my name is Tim Crozier. I'm Branch Manager for Children's Policy in DSS, and I'd also just like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians on the various lands on which we're meeting today. I'm meeting you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country here in Canberra, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and I'd also just like to extend that respect to all of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues who are joining us. I'd also just like to thank Lisa Waters and Rani Kumar and the rest of the NAPCAN team for hosting this webinar today and putting on together what I think is really an excellent program for National Child Protection Week. And the Department of Social Services is really proud to be an ongoing supporter of NAPCAN and National Child Protection Week. I'd also just like to acknowledge Paul and Helen and Jamie, who have been working with for over 2.5, close to 3 years now, I think, in terms of the development of the framework and also the action that Safe and Supported, the national framework, and also the action plans that sit underneath that for how we will actually then deliver the framework. So, Jamie, I was just going to talk, as you mentioned, just to sort of some brief words around Safe and Supported, just to sort of get everyone on the same page regarding it. I would also just, though, like to acknowledge the importance of National Child Protection Week, because I think it does provide us with a really significant and important opportunity for us to discuss, I guess, some of the difficult and the complex issues affecting child safety and well-being in Australia. So, and the theme that we've got, and you mentioned it before, for National Child Protection Week, which is where we start matters, I think actually really resonates quite strongly with the work that we're undertaking in this space as well. So we know that, you know, where children start, the resources that they have available to them, the opportunities that are sort of presented to them, have a direct impact in terms of their development and their later life outcomes as well. And, you know, children, young people across Australia, they really have a right to grow up safe, excuse me, to grow up supported, and to grow up connected in their family, in their community, in their culture. So they have a right to grow up in an environment that really enables them to reach their full potential. The Australian government itself provides sort of national leadership in terms of the well-being of Australia's children and families and communities. But I think it's important to, I guess, recognise and acknowledge that as a nation, we all have responsibility to do what we can to keep vulnerable members of our community safe. So then just in terms of Safe and Supported and its action plans, and for those of you who may not be familiar with it, I'll just talk through some of the key elements of Safe and Supported. So basically, Safe and Supported sets out Australia's 10-year strategy to make significant and sustained progress in reducing the rates of child abuse and neglect and its impact across generations. And it was developed, I think we sort of might have talked about this at the last forum as well, where it was developed in partnership between the Commonwealth, between states and territory governments, with an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership group, and also in consultation with the non-government sector through the National Coalition on Child Safety and Wellbeing. And so the framework itself sort of sets out the vision, sets out the goal, sets out focus groups, and it sets out the priority, focus areas, I should say, it sets out the priority groups. That was agreed in December 2021, so it was agreed under the previous government. And the framework has 4 priority groups, and these are the sort of the priority groups who are most at risk of coming into child protection systems. So they are children and families with multiple and complex needs, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people who are experiencing disadvantage or vulnerabilities, children and young people with disability or parents carers with disability. And then the 4th group is children and young people who have experienced abuse and neglect, or those in out-of-home care systems, or those transitioning from out-of-home care into independent living. And then the 4 focus areas for the framework are a national approach to early intervention and targeted support, also addressing the overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in child protection systems, improving information sharing, data development and analysis, and strengthening the child and family sector and workforce capability. And the framework itself is being delivered through 2 sets of 5-year action plans. The first set was agreed and launched earlier this year, in January this year. So there's sort of a first or a general action plan covering all children and all priority groups. And then there's a dedicated Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander action plan. And this is the first time that the framework has had a dedicated Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander action plan. And also Safe and Supported is also the key national initiative at the Commonwealth level for addressing Target 12 under Closing the Gap. And that target 12 is the target on reducing the rate of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in out-of-home care. And I'll just also add that listening to and responding to the voices of children, youth and families is going to be central throughout the implementation of the action plans as well. So I just wanted to now just turn to how the Commonwealth has been working with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Leadership Group and state and territory governments, as well as the National Coalition to implement the action plans. I'll first turn to the partnership agreement. So this is really sort of coming out of Closing the Gap. So consistent with Priority Form 1 in Closing the Gap, which is on formal partnerships and shared decision making, the department has been working with SNAIC, National Voice for Our Children, and the Leadership Group and states and territories to finalise a partnership agreement, and that will most likely be finalised later this year. And that partnership agreement, it really sort of captures government's commitment and approach to working in partnership, in particular shared decision making with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders, so that we can achieve the goals of Safe and Supported. And also demonstrates a fundamentally new way of working with First Nations people and communities that has that shared decision making at its heart. And I'll just sort of explain a little bit more about that shared decision making. So shared decision making means making decisions in partnership with the people in the communities who are most affected by those decisions. So we're sort of moving away from a top-down approach to government decision making, ensuring that every step in this process, in the voices and the expertise of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And there's shared decision making, or there will be shared decision making at every level of Safe and Supported governance. We've got a rather complicated governance structure. There's about 4 different layers, but we've got shared decision making at each of those layers. We have a number of working groups that we've stood up, which are really sort of driving the implementation. They're kind of doing the day-to-day work, and they're coming together specifically for that purpose of that shared decision making, and so that we can also drive coordination in the implementation of the action plans as we go forward. So I just wanted to talk a little bit more about those working groups. So as I mentioned, we've got 4 working groups. We've arranged those by themes that are common across both action plans, and that's to ensure that that work is coordinated and so that it's efficient as well. But those 4 working groups cover the following themes. They cover workforce, accountability and data, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander systems leadership, and also working together to support children and families. And each working group is also ensuring that they listen to and that they respond to the voices of lived experience. And those working groups include representatives from all parties of Safe and Supported. So that includes the Commonwealth, states and territories, the leadership group, and the National Coalition on Child Safety and Wellbeing. The last point that I just would like to make is that an underlying principle of Safe and Supported is strong monitoring and reporting and achievement of outcomes as well. So the Safe and Supported partners, we're working together to develop 2 monitoring and evaluation strategies. So there'll be a national monitoring and evaluation strategy, as well as also an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander monitoring and evaluation strategy. And that will ensure that we've got a clear focus on First Nations ways of measuring success. So the monitoring and evaluation strategies will keep us all accountable for the commitments that we've sort of laid out in the action plans, so that we are enhancing that safety and the wellbeing of Australia's children. And the strategies will explain how we measure and publicly report on progress towards outcomes, and also evaluate the impacts of Safe and Supported overall. And each of the strategies will detail how outcomes and Safe and Supported will be measured, and how we can use data and storytelling and analysis so that we can provide that full picture of progress. And the monitoring and evaluation activity for Safe and Supported will be governed through shared decision making as well, and will support data sovereignty and self-determination for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities. Jamie, you asked just what my, I think, personal reflections had been in terms of this process, and I have to say it has been, as a long-standing public servant, it has been a completely different way of working that I've experienced over the last 2.5 years. And it has really, and closing the gap has been, I think, a real game changer in this, and particularly the priority reforms out of closing the gap, partnership, the shared decision making, and so on. But it has really meant that government has had to let go of some of its power. We're in the shared decision making is about parties coming together as equals. And that can be quite uncomfortable for public servants, particularly if they've been a public servant for a long period of time. And the other thing is that this was the first initiative as well, that was the first national initiative, I should say, that was negotiated after Closing the Gap, the new Closing the Gap agreement. And we didn't really have a textbook for how we work through shared decision making. So we've really had to learn as we go. And we've made mistakes along the way. I hope that we've learned from those mistakes, but we've also got a long way to go as well. But I might stop there and pass back to you, Jamie.
Thank you, Tim. That was a great overview from not only the Commonwealth, but your perspective as well. And just a reminder to our participants that feel free to post any comments or observations or questions into the chat as we go. And as we've heard from all 3 panel members, we'll circle back to those and open up for more of a broader conversation. So there'll be opportunity for people to unpick and explore some of the issues that are raised by our presenters. Paul, governments of various flavours at both levels, all three levels, Commonwealth, jurisdictional and local government increasingly, have often spoken about working in partnership and consultation and shared decision making. What are some of your observations that has put that type of approach into practice and formalise some of those commitments rather than being a higher level contextual approach that can sometimes still see governments and the community sector for that matter largely bowl on the way that they've always done things because they think they know best, and that the honest ideals of that approach aren't fully realised, even though that's the stated objective at the start of the development of a national framework like Safe and Supported. Over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Jamie. A really simple question to kick off with. And look, I think I'll get to that by, I think, telling a bit of the story of my experience with the leadership group in the development of this. But I want to, of course, acknowledge how great it is to be joining you from Larrakia country, beautiful country up here in Darwin, and who are hosting the Snake conference, where we have 1,600 people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and our non-Indigenous allies coming together to talk about how we improve the well-being of Aboriginal children. I want to thank NAPCAN for hosting this conversation, and I acknowledge the contributions and leadership of my colleagues joining the conversations today, Helen, Tim, and Jamie, of course, and everyone who works every day upholding our shared responsibilities to our children. I appreciate Tim going through some of the history of the national framework and outlining the sort of where we landed and some of the things that are different in Safe and Supported. I think as part of the leadership group, part of our challenge was that as we started developing the refresh of the national framework, we had to acknowledge that the previous national framework, the previous action plans, had not delivered for First Nations children in the way that we needed it to. So we had to not just refresh the framework, we also had to change the process by which we work together so that we can achieve those different outcomes that we needed for First Nations children, families, and communities. So from the outset, we tried to have a different conversation. We wanted to encourage governments to recognise that the change we needed for First Nations children is not the same as the type of change that's needed for non-Indigenous children. It's just not. And as governments have increasingly acknowledged the role of settler colonial interventions underpinning the ongoing overrepresentation of our children, both at risk and within child protection systems, sadly, we had to acknowledge that the reform agenda has still kind of stalled at how we make those systems better, how we make them more effective, how we try to make them more culturally safe. And if I can kind of put it in a different way, in a challenging way, it's like governments have been trying to hone how they intervene in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families, and wondering why we keep coming up with the same outcomes we have always come up with. And so because the change needed is different, we needed a different action plan, and Tim kind of touched on some of that. As a leadership group, we wanted an action plan that centered both the systems and the practice change that is needed to achieve that shared vision that all children in Australia reach their full potential by growing up in safe and caring homes, free from harm and neglect. And I think if there's one thing I took from Judge Eva's conversation yesterday here at the Snake conference, was that while we have shared language around what it means to uphold the rights and the interests of children, including their right to be free from harm and neglect, we need to understand those frameworks have a cultural perspective inherent within them. And so when we start translating even the Convention on the Rights of the Child, we need to apply it in a way that reflects the values and the perspectives of the communities that we're trying to serve. And that means taking a distinct First Nations approach to the rights of First Nations children. And I really appreciate the way the Uluru Statement has positioned this discussion. And I'm sure you're all very familiar with the Uluru Statement. I certainly hope you are. And I feel like it's really worth repeating. And I acknowledge that our communities have been making the same point for generations. It's not a new idea. But the Uluru Statement said in part, our children are alienated from their families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem. This is the torment of our powerlessness. When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish. And we see the same reality stated clearly from other similarly situated Indigenous peoples. We heard it very clearly from our Maori colleagues in Aotearoa yesterday, but I hear the same things when I speak to other similar populations in Canada and the United States. So as a leadership group, we pushed for a focused action plan and importantly, a distinct theory of change, one that recognised that the harm of non-Indigenous worldviews and decision-making about our children was part of the problem that we needed to solve. And so an action plan that was instead oriented towards changing how governments exercise authority over our children, one that is not oriented towards changing how governments exercise authority over Aboriginal children, but actually about how Aboriginal communities can reclaim our inherent right to shape our own children's future, to shape our children's futures. And we leaned on the Family Matters building blocks to help shape that, which focuses on access to quality, culturally safe child and family services, the transformation of legislation, policies and practice, ensuring that First Nations not only participate in but have control over decisions that affect our kids, and making systems more accountable to First Nations children, families and communities that they're supposed to be serving. The other thing that we had during this refresh, and I agree with Tim, it was a game changer, was the national agreement, which meant we had a different foundation for the relationship with government, one that was grounded on those 4 priority reforms: shared decision making, prioritising community control, transforming governments, and putting data in the hands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to support their decision making. So as I said, this gave us a new basis for negotiating with government, and so it's something that we certainly exercised in our work with our government partners, which was a new experience for everyone. It was a very new way of working, and honestly, it's one that we're still learning together. And I appreciate, and I certainly want to acknowledge the way that people like Tim and Helen have leaned into that need for change, have tried to shift their status quo and to work differently with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And as a leadership group, we know that this stretches people out of their comfort zone. But I suspect from working with Tim and Helen that they would acknowledge that and agree that we should all be very uncomfortable with the status quo anyway. So while we are settling into those governance structures together, governance structures that Tim rather diplomatically mentioned as complex and layered, there has been shared recognition that we do need to create new spaces where governments and First Nations can come together, negotiate and reach agreement on new actions. And you'll see those features in the action plans, the goals that we have set together. So as I said, first up, action 1, number 1, transferring authority to First Nations communities. How important it is that it's our communities that make decisions about our kids' futures, that we shape what those futures look like and the basis on which those decisions are made. We have actions about building the infrastructure to make sure that we're collecting the right data about what's important for Aboriginal children and families and their communities, and that we're utilising that data in an ongoing way so that we are clear that the actions we're taking are achieving the aspirations that communities have for their children. We need to really lean into addressing the discriminatory nature of funding processes that we have today. And we know they're discriminatory because for too long they have under-resourced First Nations in delivering the services that our communities need. And being able to target those supports, not just at responding to risk, but addressing the social determinants that create the circumstances for that risk. You know, we don't want to, I think one of the things that everyone has spoken about with Safe and Supported is it's not just about responding better after harm. It's doing the work at the front end so the harm doesn't occur. Wherever we can prevent that harm, that is the ideal outcome, that's the ideal solution. So alongside that, we have actions that are about driving active casework practice and ensuring families have access to quality advocacy and legal support through that process. And this will mean that systems are not only better focused on delivering supports and that those supports are accessible and aligned to the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families, but that they're, sorry, I've lost my page. That those systems are better at delivering those supports. They're accessible to families, they're aligned to their needs, and they're genuinely delivered by and for and of communities that they're supposed to be serving. We've called for, and I know we've called for this for a long time, and independent Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander commissioners, a national commissioner and one in each jurisdiction, making sure that there is a clear and properly empowered focus to ensure the rights of our children are not being breached by governments. And sadly, that's a point that seems as relevant as ever today. We have seen the positive impact of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children's commissioners in the jurisdictions where there has been leadership on this issue. They shine a very bright light on the rights and interests of our children, and they're a really critical piece of this overall puzzle for improving outcomes in an ongoing sense. We're as a leadership group, we're very tired of this cycle of reviews. We want to move towards continuous action for improvement, because obviously we're not going to solve this issue overnight. And I want to be really honest, I suppose, too. I'm wary about where this is going, because I feel like as communities, we've had these conversations before. We've had them too many times. And ultimately, in the past, when the time for action comes, when it's time for real substantive change, when the time comes for investing in the futures of First Nations children as First Nations children, our communities have been disappointed. And instead of transformation, we end up with a seemingly never-ending cycle of inquiries and reviews. And certainly, while I haven't had a chance to look at it in detail, I understand that we had another review released earlier this week from Victoria, challenging existing child protection systems in that jurisdiction. So certainly, there's no more excuses. I think, number one, we have the framework. We know and have a clear and a shared understanding of what needs to change. And through the Safe and Supported, we have governments committed to working differently to make sure that we deliver on those actions. And I do want to say, obviously, with shared decision making, we also have the recent Productivity Commission report. And I think, I hope that our government partners share the concerns that were raised through that report, and are keen on working with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership group to make sure we learn the lessons that we need to from that report. I mean, that didn't focus on the Safe and Supported partnership, but I think we would be missing an opportunity if we didn't think about what that meant for us as a partnership and how we work together in future. And I am grateful for the spirit with which governments and the non-government sector have engaged with this conversation today. As I say, I know this is a very new way of working that we're looking for. But, as I heard an executive of a large non-Indigenous NGO note yesterday in the conference, there is a growing realization that maintaining the status quo means accepting complicity in a system that harms the very children we say we are serving. That's the bottom line for me of Safe and Supported. It's why it's so important. And it is only by delivering on the actions in full that we will shift outcomes for Aboriginal children and families.
Thank you, Paul. Again, a wonderful series of insights and observations. And when we head to the discussion later on, we might unpack it a little bit further. But just for people as participants of today's webinar, the very short version of what shared decision-making means in a Safe and Supported context is that an equal number of representatives from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership group sit down with an equal number of government representatives and decision makers, and that is the decision-making forum on which matters related to Safe and Supported are considered. So that shared decision-making isn't about having one or two representatives from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership group and an NGO representative in the room with 10 or 12 other senior officials from government, and not that it's an us versus them in any way, shape or form, but I just wanted to highlight that shared decision-making approach that has been written down and agreed by all parties actually commits everyone to sitting down in an equal representative manner and sharing that power by, in crude terms, having 5 on 5 on each side or around the table. And that is the body that actually takes recommendations forward through to community services ministers, which is ultimately where Safe and Supported sits. And that even at that level, there has been engagement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representatives at the CSM level, sitting beside ministers from the jurisdictions and the Commonwealth and having those discussions.
Sure, Jamie,
if I can. Fair representation, Paul?
Yeah, and I just want to, I suppose, make clear that what we've really tried to do is, in addition to that parity, making clear that this is about an agreement-making process between, you know, if I can oversimplify, effectively two parties, right? Settler governments, and I apologise for that term if it's discomforting for people, but settler governments and First Nations as two distinct parties who are coming together to reach agreements on how we do this. And even when it comes to things like the community services ministers, really trying to make clear that we're creating a new space. We're not inviting Aboriginal leaders into the meeting of ministers, but having a new space where ministers meet with Aboriginal leadership to come to agreements together. So we're really trying to change the context of agreement so that it's not a consultative process where we're urging governments to make different decisions, but together we are making different decisions.
Thanks, Paul. And I'm about to throw to you, Helen, for your observations, particularly from a jurisdictional perspective, and invite you to talk about your experiences in the approach and the manner in which the Queensland Government in particular, but also other jurisdictional governments have engaged in this process and what you see as different and challenging. Before I do throw to you, I'm conscious that I keep looking down away from the screen, and that's because I'm monitoring participant questions coming through the chat function. So I'm not, well, I hope I'm not being disrespectful to our speakers, but that's the purpose behind me looking down. And there's some great questions coming through. So I encourage everyone to continue to post those questions. And after we hear from Helen, we'll return to some of those questions and broaden the discussion out and invite participation from our webinar participants directly. So Helen, over to you.
Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, everyone. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for acknowledging the Larrakia people whose lands we are on at the moment. The weather has certainly been turned on for us here on Larrakia lands, and it's beautiful. I also acknowledge that I live and work on the lands of the Yagara and the Turrbal people, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I acknowledge our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues as well. I think it's really interesting, you know, one of the things that I think has been really different about this process has been that it's really asked us as government members and representatives to move from what have historically been transactional activities. You know, government asks for an action plan and a strategy and genuinely wants to see differences and different outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and that starts what is a transactional process. I think what Paul and Tim have been describing, and Jamie too, has been one that actually this has been based on relationships. And certainly in my time in intergovernmental relations, I think we've had a stability in government participants that we haven't had for a long time before. And it's really hard to say to people, trust us and work with us and let's work together when you're asking people to work with a different person every time. So I think the thing for me has been a real recognition that we have to actually do this together, it can't be who happens to be in a particular role in a government agency at a particular point in time. It's actually got to be me as Helen and my experience and my expertise and my relationships with my colleagues across the country and within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership group, and how we are working together to achieve an outcome that we all want. You know, there is no suggestion we don't all want the same outcome. That is clear. What's critical is how we're going to get there, and the how for me is the relationships change this time. And so I think if I think about those of us in public sector, you know, we have a particular role to play in managing government business, right? That's what you do. That's what I do in a strategic policy area. That's what my colleagues in program areas do. It's what my colleagues in frontline service delivery do. They work in their space in government, managing government business. And so what we have to do is a really great word, Paul, you talked about it yesterday as well, is the reimagining. We have to reimagine what life looks like, and that's incumbent on all of us at each of our levels, whether we are working directly with families or we're navigating government systems at the levels that Tim and I navigate government systems. We have to reimagine what that looks like in a relationships-based context. And I think that's where our challenges start. It's also where our solutions lie. You know, that's what the bit. And I think when we caught up beforehand, and I said to Tim, you know, like, there have been plenty of times when Tim and I have had some lovely tense conversations throughout this whole process. But I think what we both have come to it with is actually there is a mutual respect and a willingness and a desire to actually get this right. And we know that what state governments, the way state government processes work and the way the federal government process works is not necessarily always the same. But our job is to find a way through. That's our job. And so, and I think that's actually been a really great experience and a great opportunity. And it really, I think it really helps to understand your role, you know, that your role in, what is your role in the system? And then, so if you start from the shared platform of what we're all trying to achieve, you're committed to doing it in a relationships-based approach. And then it helps you understand what your role is within the bigger picture about navigating the system to effect the change that's needed to achieve the change we all want and that we know needs to be achieved. I think that, you know, just at this conference, it's just been such a clear example of the incredible things that are happening. And so while the national framework sits at that national level and the conversations around it can feel quite disconnected for people, when we hear of all the wonderful things that we've been listening about and hearing about for the last couple of days, and we'll do so for the next couple of days, I mean, gosh, it's pretty amazing. Like it is there, and our job is to figure out how government can get out of the way. How do we, all those processes and systems that Paul talked to about, commissioning processes and investment decisions, and how do we create a system that meets the needs of a culturally responsive approach? It meets the needs of all of our commitment to accountability and transparency and doing things in a way that is right from that perspective as well. So I suppose for me, that's that bit about, you know, finding your bit and finding what your responsibility is and being really clear to own it, you know, to know what you need to own and do it. One of the young men who spoke in the last session yesterday afternoon, I wrote it down because he said, if you've got a platform, use it. And I think that's actually what we all need to do. We need to find our platform and we need to make sure that we use it in a way that is consistent with what we're trying to do every single day. And that does also, I think, from a personal perspective, help us manage things that might otherwise be uncomfortable, because part of it has to be the self-reflection. It has to be about what's the process I'm using now, what's the process I'm navigating next, and what relationships does in that context is it lets you give things a go. And so I'm really confident that if I said to Paul or Natalie or any of the other members of the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander leadership group, hey, what about this? I'm pretty sure they'd say to me, yeah, no, Helen, that's probably not such a great idea. Or have you thought about doing it this way? Or is, you know, what's wrong with this process? Or why? Just even the question why? Why would that be the way you would do it? If you don't have good relationships with people, then actually that's much harder. And it's much harder to navigate through those challenges that arise. So I suppose my underlying thing about what's different this time, the difference for me this time is relationships. I think we're nearly there in nailing that. We've got to find a way to keep it. That's the bit for me.
Thank you, Helen. I appreciate those insights on your experiences. We are about to open up and go to some of the questions that have been posted into the chat. So if there are reflections or comments or queries that workshop participants had, please continue to have them come through. I'm the facilitator, so my role is to facilitate the conversation, but NatCan were silly enough to give me a microphone, so I'll take the opportunity. Whilst the context of this conversation has largely been about government and focused upon how governments have engaged and are doing things differently in a conjunction and partnership with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership group, a lot of the commentary is echoed across the non-government sector as well. And from a national coalition perspective, we need to do things differently as a non-Indigenous service sector. If we don't change the way that we go about things, then we're going to continue to see some of the outcomes that we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years, which haven't been to the benefit to all Australian children and young people, but particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people. So as a general observation, given I've got the microphone, when we think about governments doing things differently, it's also about the system doing things differently. And the systems and the policies set by government and our decision makers will only be realised if the non-government sector, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, take those on board and honestly engage in those settings in a different way as well. And at a practical level, what that might mean for a non-Indigenous organisation in a region or a community is that if there is a funding opportunity coming up that is overwhelmingly focused on First Nations children and families as the target group, or is likely to benefit First Nations children and families as the target group, then one of the decisions that we might need to make as a non-Indigenous organisation is to say, I'm actually going to step back. I would normally put in a bid for that funding, but I'm not. My way of supporting self-determination and contributing to achieving the outcomes and safe and supported is to not automatically put a bid in for that source of funding. What I might do is go down the road and have a chat with my local AMS or my local ACO and say, hi, this is something we're interested in, but we're not intending to put in an application, but we'd like to have a conversation with you about how we could potentially support this ACO if you were interested in putting in for that funding to support the bid that you're going to put in within your community. So as a non-Indigenous organisation, non-government organisation, we also have a very distinct role and need to embrace and meaningfully engage in the change that's before us as well, because if our child protection rates have gone up over the last 10 or 12 years, even with the commitments and goodwill of the first framework, and if we know that First Nations children represent about 6% of our childhood population across the country, but represent somewhere close to 50% or over of children involved in the child protection system, we can't keep doing things the same way we have been doing them over the last 240 years, because it's just simply not working. So as we go to question, I invite our panel members to pick up on any of the comments or observations that your fellow panel members made, but through their respective presentations. But to kick things off, picking up on that reimagining comment that you made, Helen, there's a question for both Helen and Tim. If we are to reimagine the whole system, it actually takes the whole system to act differently. So in that sense, how are you as actors within your respective governments engaging beyond your immediate portfolios? All families are different. All families are represented in a variety of government portfolios respectively, whether it's health, education, treasury, economics. To change and influence the systems where you're working, how are you talking or engaging from your respective portfolio areas across your government to really bed down the commitments within Safe and Supported and the approach that's been adopted? Maybe if I went to Helen first.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. I mean, it's a really good question, isn't it? Because I think one of the, the challenges that all of us have always faced, and we need to work through, is the challenge of silos in government structures when our lives are not siloed. We don't. The needs of our children around education are not discrete or independent of their needs in terms of their healthcare and what is happening for them in other parts of their life. We've been really fortunate in Queensland. We have had for about 7 years now, we have had a commitment to a partnership with Family Matters Queensland. And in 2016, a whole group of elders from Queensland came together at a space in Brisbane that was significant and worked through what needs to happen in Queensland. And it was based on the Family Matters building blocks. And what that did was provide a structure and a generational strategy saying, so it is going to take a generation, picking up on Paul's point about we're not going to fix it overnight. But through the Our Way, which is our generational strategy in Queensland, and it was very clearly a jointly owned strategy, continues to be a jointly owned strategy between Queensland Government and our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues in Queensland and partners in Queensland. That set a really clear platform for us. Does that mean that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families have had a different experience of our child protection system moving forward? Well, the answer is no. And the answer is no, because what Our Way recognised in the generational strategy was that there are a whole series of structures that we have to break down and rebuild. And we have to rethink about how they're going to do them. So we've got this platform that lets us do that. Then over the top of that, over the last six or 7 years, we've then had other commitments from the Queensland Government around a local thriving communities commitment, which has two parts. It's about establishing our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships Department, establishing local decision-making bodies, and progressively local decision-making bodies being the ones who decide what government services are provided and how they're provided, and making decisions for their communities. And now we're obviously on our path to treaty. And so every one of these policy platforms from the Queensland Government have kept us moving in the same direction. And what those policy platforms do is they give us a common thread for our conversations across the different departments. And I think that's the really that's an interesting part in government about how we look at our health strategy and our health equity strategy, and we look at our education strategy, and we look at Our Way, and we bring them all together because they can look like pieces of paper, but from a public policy perspective, what they give us is the framework and the authorising environment for doing things differently at all different levels in departments across government, whether it's the Child Protection Department or Education Department. There is an authorising environment to do things differently. So that's been really good for us. It's been good for us to have that as a mechanism that we can draw on when we are talking with our colleagues across government. And so in terms of safe and supported, that again has been good for us. It's kind of it fits nicely with the path that Queensland has already been on, and kind of gives us another bit of momentum in our direction. So that's kind of how we bring it all together.
Thanks, Helen. And Tim, how do you wrangle your colleagues in Treasury to release more funding and within education to ensure that there are more flexible approaches to engage First Nations children in the education system? What are the steps that you're taking, or Families and Children's Policy Group within DSS taking to prosecute the safe and supported agenda across the Commonwealth Government?
Yeah, it's a good question, Jamie, and it's complex in terms of, as we know, the social determinants of child protection. It's complex in terms of the array of systems. It's complex in terms of the number of sort of national initiatives that we've got, not just the national framework, but also associated with that there's the national strategy to prevent and respond to child sexual abuse. There's the national plan to end violence against women. There's development at the moment on the early years strategy. Like it is a complex piece, and it cuts across people's lives, as Helen was just talking, cuts across different sort of portfolios. We did have cross-government arrangements set up under the previous national framework that provided us with, at the Commonwealth level, to sort of talk with our colleagues in education and health and NIAA and others as well, Treasury and others as well. For us sort of going forward, we've actually, and it's becoming more and more critical given the national initiatives I've just mentioned before, we do sit on each other's working groups and governance arrangements and that type of thing. But there is actually an action within the action plan that goes to how do we sort of address the social determinants, but particularly working across portfolios. And that goes to putting in place a communication and collaboration mechanism and process across those different portfolios, so that we're better able to connect across services, across portfolios, but in particular across those national initiatives that are also supporting what we're trying to achieve through Safe and Supported. So that's the sort of the work that we're doing at the moment with our Commonwealth colleagues to sort of sharpen up that approach that we're doing across the portfolios, because as I mentioned, it's a complex space, and we need to be working with others if we're going to actually have an impact and deliver on the things that we had set out in Safe and Supported.
Thanks, Tim. Paul, I might throw to you just for reflections from someone outside of government, how do you think it's going? Are you seeing any differences in what you've experienced previously, or what is it that you would like to see happening across government horizontally to ensure that those commitments of accountability, of shared decision making, of genuine engagement is replicated beyond the two departments that Tim and Helen represent in their respective areas?
Sure, and I agree with what Helen said earlier, that it is fundamentally what's different about this is about the relationships and the continuity that we've had with that recently, or certainly over the last few years, has really helped to build the way that we all work together. And I think that's a really important piece of the puzzle. But I do think that part of the challenge that we're all facing is that governments, and Tim and Helen sort of both touched on, governments are structured to function in a particular way. And that is as much true in the rooms that we share together as it is anywhere else. And part of the way that governments are kind of the culture of governments to function is to talk about the great things that they're doing. The actions that they are taking to achieve some sort of public outcome, because that's what they're there for and that's what they're oriented towards. And certainly part of the conversations that we've been trying to have with through Safe and Supported is really emphasizing that part of this puzzle isn't about how governments solve this challenge, but about how governments engage with communities together to solve that challenge. And Helen touched on that a bit earlier in saying it's changed the way that governments come and approach the leadership group, and they feel comfortable approaching us. And one of the things that we say is, at the very first, you should engage with the community that you're working with at the start of the process, not a month down the track, not 6 months down the track, but at the very start of the process, because it shapes how we define the problem, shapes how we understand the solutions. And I think that's been some of the richest areas of discussion, is understanding how we sometimes define those problems differently. I think for me, the other side, and I really want to pick up on something that Helen said, that sometimes it's about the structures we need to break down and rebuild. And I think that's really true, because what comes with that are the assumptions that underpin those structures, or that are reproduced through those structures. And it constrains the sort of change that we can make. It's like if you've got a house where you feel like the foundations aren't quite right, it doesn't matter how many times you renovate the house, knock down some internal walls, all that sort of stuff. If you're not willing to touch the foundations, then the house will always be a particular shape, a particular size, will operate in a particular way. You can renovate within that, but you're still stuck within the boundaries of the foundations. And really, some of the work that we need to do is addressing those foundations. We need to shift a system, and I hope part of what I heard in both Tim and like sitting behind Tim and Helen's response is a need to rebuild some of those systems so that children are at the center of them. We all share this, the theme this week: every child in every community needs a fair go. And can we honestly, as a society, look at ourselves and say that's what we deliver? And so we need to rebuild those foundations from the ground up. And I think this has really serious implications, not just for the children and families that we serve, but the practitioners, the frontline staff who deliver these services, who are often, because of the foundations of the system, are trying to find ways around the system to deliver what they want or they feel they need to deliver for families. I remember when I was doing practice work, some of the best practitioners were the ones that were best able to work around the system. And the absurdity of that is really obvious, right? The system should be about enabling practitioners to do the justice-focused work that is necessary for families, not putting practitioners in positions where they feel like they have to work around those systems to deliver justice. And I think that's part of the burnout, that's part of the mental health crisis that affects our workforce. And so rather than, whilst things like the supports we put in place to support the mental health of our workforce are critical, I think we also need to think about how the systems play a part in creating some of that challenge and shift that challenge so that people can do the sorts of work that they get into this space to do, right? I genuinely believe that people get into social work and these sorts of professions because of commitments to justice, the inherent dignity of people wanting to do best for their communities. And sadly, in some ways, the systems we have inherited from generations get in the way of us doing that. So we do need to think about the structures that we need to break down and rebuild, get right down into those foundations.
Thank you, Paul. A couple of tongue-in-cheek observations. I'm going to steal your house analogy. That was one of the most concise ways of representing the issue. So hopefully that's not copyrighted. And also talk about being on message. The theme for today is where we start matters. And Paul's used an analogy that talks about getting the foundations right, and where you start, it doesn't matter what you modify on a foundation that isn't right. All you're doing is modifying and addressing the challenges rather than doing something of substance. So Helen and Tim, Paul's currently in the lead for the free coffee for the best connection to the webinar theme. I'd also like to just circle back to a comment that you made, Paul, but open it up to everyone to observe that from a practitioner perspective or a service perspective, we often draw upon our own commitments and energy and can see a way in which we want to change and work differently. And one of the comments that we have in the chat sort of relates, I think, in part to that momentum for change. And whilst we can get excited about reimagining the possibility or positively engage with the challenges of working in a different way for better outcomes, at a service delivery or practitioner level in engaging with children and families, do people think that Safe and Supported is actually set up and is already changing practitioner behaviour and engagement and the way that we work with children and families for the better? Or are we at that point where we actually need to think about there is a momentum for that change and a recognition that we need to do things differently, but how do we bake that in so that we do create that change at an interface level with children and families?
I've got some thoughts, and I'm also build on your analogy about the house. I think the thing for me is that Safe and Supported does talk to the foundations, doesn't it? Like it talks to what are the and like the Family Matters building blocks. What are the things we have to structurally get right? But we're not building a new house. We actually have an entire structure that sits above it that we have to try and keep stable and keep steady while we change the foundations and then move it through. So I'm not a builder. I've got no building expertise whatsoever, but I imagine you can't just rip out those weight-bearing walls and have a foundation that's still there. So that's what I talk about in terms of navigating. That actually for those of us at different parts of the system, we have to navigate. Maybe we should be engineers, Tim, but we have to navigate how we keep those. How do we keep a foundation with enough stable pieces in it while we change the rest of the foundation in the direction we need it to be, and at the same time it's not a greenfield site. So that I think is the challenge for all of us in this conversation, and that's why relationships are so important for me, because I think that's what it lets us have the conversation about what's the next bit of foundation we're going to try and change, and do we all agree that that's the next bit, and what are the bits for Tim in having to navigate the Commonwealth government business, and for me in navigating state government business, and for Paul and colleagues navigating their parts of the business. Yeah, that's the trick, I think. And so people may not see, people won't see a change from Safe and Supported immediately. But what we want them to have is an experience, a difference of the how things are happening in the not too distant future, would be my thought, And it starts with the how in terms of our partnership with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Leadership Group. And then it's the how, in terms of for us in Queensland, it's the how our partners in the sector experience our relationships and our engagements, and the way we are starting to talk about and manage commissioning and all those other pieces of the puzzle that we need to get right. So that's just my thought. Do I win a coffee yet?
Thanks, Helen. Tim or Paul? Tim, any observations from you on that issue?
Yeah, no, I agree with the comments from Helen. I was actually just going to, I'm not sure if this exactly answers the question, Jamie, but I'm just sort of reflecting on the work that we're doing around the Improving Multidisciplinary Responses program, which is under Safe and Support. It's one of the activities under Safe and Support. It's one of the activities that is specifically about trying to address or respond to Target 12 and out-of-home, reducing the overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in out-of-home care. And it's specifically, we've gone out to a grant process. And actually, this is an example where we did shared decision making at a sort of a program level, where we developed the grant opportunity guidelines, worked with members of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership group to develop up the grant opportunity guidelines. Then we went out to the process in terms of putting through our community grants hub to ask for applications in, and then we worked with our state and territory colleagues, as well as also the leadership group or other members of the leadership group, to then select the successful applicants through that process. And that's been announced. There's 15 organisations that we're funding. They're all First Nations organisations. We haven't actually announced the individual organisations, but we've just announced that there's been 15 that have been funded. But the reason I mentioned this one is because it is about government also stepping back and saying, we want to fund First Nations organisations, Aboriginal community controlled organisations that are on the ground in their communities to enhance their service or to develop their service so that they're providing holistic, multidisciplinary responses to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families who potentially are at risk of coming into child protection assistance. So how can they work with the families that are in their community in the ways that they know best, and in particular about embedding the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child placement principle. So I guess in a small way, I sort of see this as government trying to facilitate, stepping back, but trying to facilitate that work so that practitioners can get on and do the work that they do best, and working in that holistic way. So for me, that's kind of a bit of an example of hopefully how we're sort of getting to that partnership working and seeing that in practice and shared decision making in practice, but also how we're enabling organisations and practitioners to work in the ways that they know best.
Paul, any observations or remarks from you on that particular one before we go somewhere else?
Yeah, and I think, yeah, I certainly agree with Helen's observation that you know, it's not as simple as just we don't have a greenfield site, and so it's not as simple as just starting again. And that would be lovely. We would all love that. And I appreciate the challenge of we're kind of in some places our child protection system is in such a crisis, and the volume that we're expecting practitioners to carry with respect to supporting families, it's almost it's problematic to even suggest that while people are trying to hold the roof up, I'm sitting here talking about how we muddle around in the foundations. So I appreciate the challenge with that, and it is going to take courage for us to be able to manage those two issues at the same time. And I think what I don't want to see is that some of those challenges become excuses for us to never get to the foundations, because that's kind of, I think, where we've landed over many generations, and we end up with a kind of, you know, not where we want to be. So we do need to embrace the nature of that change. We do need to acknowledge those realities, and we need to make sure that we all work together on how we can actually get around to doing both of those things at once. But I think to get to sort of look at it from a different direction, one of the things that we do at Jumbunna is we'll have families contact us seeking support from various in various jurisdictions who are going through the child protection system at the time. And I guess, have I seen the sorts of principles and ideas in Safe and Supported reflected in their experiences? Because ultimately they're the people that we're talking about, right? It's those kids and those families that we want to see change for. And we have to honestly say that no, we haven't seen that come down. We haven't seen the change from up here come down. And I think it is something that the leadership group is very concerned about. I suspect our government partners on the other side of the table share that concern. And we need to have a think about how we can do better at making sure that those conversations while we're sitting around talking about the blueprint, sorry, I'm really stretching this analogy, that we do have those children and those families center of mind, and that we are talking to them, we are hearing them, and that we're thinking about the changes that we need. And I think fundamentally that means we need to think about how we create more space for our practitioners to do the work with families that they need to do. And that's going to be a challenge for governments and for our community partners. But honestly, I think we need to really think about how we create that space so that we do start having that more enabling of the sort of just practice. Because it's not as simple as providing training to people. I mean, it is important that we provide ongoing training to people, but I don't think our workforce is the problem here. And it's disrespectful, I think, for us to assume that it is a knowledge or a skills problem in the workforce. We haven't got the structures right for practitioners to do the work that they want to do. And so that's a responsibility that we share to make sure that we're able to do that.
Thanks, Paul. We've got 15 minutes to go in today's webinar, and I've got some sponsor adverts towards the end. So we've probably got 10 minutes of open discussion left. Picking up on that workforce comment that you made, it triggered one of the questions in the chat around, and I acknowledge, Paul, your comment that it's not, in your view, it's not necessarily about a skills or denigration of people currently in the workforce or limitations of the capacity of people currently in the workforce, but that is a broader issue. We all know that workforce as a whole and our ability to have sufficient workers and people in the field to respond to the growth in demand is a challenge. So linking two questions together for sake of time, did anyone want to comment on workforce strategy and development initiatives underway or on the cards for Safe and Supported? And related to that is a question around funding. And not only how will workforce strategies be developed, but with the growth in demand and a recognition that even though we're implementing a range of initiatives that will change the system, there's likely to be an increase in demand and an increase in impost around embracing the change and transitioning to new structures. How are some of these initiatives related to workforce and other Safe and Supported activities going to be supported from a financial perspective? Dutifully, everyone's looking down. I might throw to Tim.
I'll jump in first, Jamie, and thanks for the question. The funding question is a difficult question, but I'll sort of explain, I guess, the actions in the action plans, and there's actions relating to workforce and predominantly around development of the workforce in both the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander action plan as well as also the first action plan. And the actions are sort of reasonably similar in the sense that they start with scoping the current and future needs of the broad sector as well as also the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workforce. So that work is currently underway, or it's starting. It's sort of early stages yet, but that's starting in terms of understanding the demand and also the need that's there. I probably should have prefaced this by saying that I think workforce is the biggest challenge that we've got going forward. And so this real piece at the start where we're sort of really trying to understand the demand, the scope, and the future need is going to be really important. From that will then flow and we'll work with the leadership group, with states and territories and with the National Coalition in terms of then what are the strategies to put in place. Once we understand that picture, what are the strategies that we'll put in place then to address the workforce challenges that we have. And that goes to the Commonwealth levers that we have. How do we sort of grow the pipeline and what's the supports, what's the training, etc. But states and territories will also be heavily involved in this as well. So to come to the funding question will really depend on what are the strategies that and the initiatives that come out of that first piece of work. So I can't answer that at this point in time, but that will be something that we'll be working through over. I was just trying to look at the time frame around it, but the actual scoping work will be done within the next 6 to 12 months.
Thank you,
Tim.
I think, Helen.
I think the other thing I would say is that you know, our commissioner here in Queensland, Commissioner Lewis, she talks about there's like kind of different parts of the system that we need to be focused on. We need to be focused on keeping kids out of the system. We need to be focused on getting better outcomes for kids in the system, and we need to be focused on getting kids in the system home. And each of those has a different workforce requirement. And then each of those has a different workforce requirement depending on whether you're in Southeast Queensland in Brisbane or whether you're in Mount Isa or the Gulf or Cape, right? So there's this other bit, isn't there, about how are we taking a systems approach, and that's a kind of an opportunity as well. I think is that we're looking at all those levers from the big picture ones that the Commonwealth has through to the local ones that are state and territory driven and community sector driven, because I think, you know, professional on the job readiness cannot be understated in terms of importance of support and peer support for those of us who've been around for a while, taking responsibility to grow our colleagues and help our colleagues grow. So for me, it is about, like, when we take a systems view at it, making sure that we're not oversimplifying, you know, because oversimplification just doesn't help. We actually we have incredibly skilled people out there in all different parts of the system, and it's recognizing how do we, as Paul said, how do we make sure that the system does a couple of things. One is it helps those who are there do their jobs well, but the other one is that how do we create a system that makes our sector, all the parts of our sector, a desirable place for people to want to work. You know, that's the other thing. We have to think about that too, and we have to. A large part of that is about the way we talk about the narrative, the way we talk about the sector and the system and the work that people do, and the value we ascribe to the different parts of the system.
Thank you, Helen. Paul.
Look, I think Tim has made a great point around the workforce has quite a lag time. I mean, sure, there's a part that's sort of retooling the current workforce, but developing a future workforce needs us to project ahead. And I think the thing I really want to reiterate is we need to project ahead for the system that we want, not the system that we have. We don't want the imperatives of current workforce demands to then shape that future system. And I'm mindful that presently, I haven't looked at the roles recently, but 60% of our funding goes towards out-of-home care and those sorts of things. Something like 17% is directed to family supports. And obviously, we all want that to kind of flip without taking anything away from those kids who need our support in out-of-home care now. But that means we're going to need to build the workforce with the specialized skills for family support. It's a slightly different way, the specialization that's needed there. And I think picking up on something Helen said, the narrative that we have is not just important for the workforce. This is ultimately, as Tim touched on, a funding issue, which means it's a political issue. And if I can be I hate speaking like this, so please don't hold it against me, but the reality is that child safety is not a vote winner. It's not a thing that that governments campaign on. It's not a conversation that we have publicly. And the vast majority of the Australian public has probably had no interaction with the child protection system at all. They don't understand how it works, and often their only knowledge of it comes from sensationalized media reporting of when, you know, really shocking things happen to children and young people. But we know from our work that that's not the everyday reality of this system. and the families that we work with. And so we need to have I really hope that we can have a new public conversation about how we make Australia the best place to raise children. So that, and to pick up with the vision of safe and supported more generally, so that all children in all communities can thrive, and not have this kind of very individualistic approach of, well, I'm taking care of my family and every other family should take care of themselves. That's not how communities work, and that's not how families thrive. There's some, as much as I have challenges with the existing attachment literature and the way that it is imposed with respect to Aboriginal children and families. When I was doing some research on this, I remember I came across this quote from John Bowlby back in the 50s and 60s when attachment was being coined, and he unfortunately used very 50s language, so I'm going to leave that aside, but talked about a society that really values its children will cherish their parents and their families. And I think that ultimately is why we're all in this space. But I think we need a better public conversation about what that means for the families that we work with every day and how we better cherish those families so that their kids can thrive.
Thanks, Paul. In the last couple of minutes we've got, I'd like to go, there are still a lot of questions that unfortunately we haven't had time to get to, but a key one that I wanted to pose before we wrap up the conversation is the role of prevention. And the Australian Child Maltreatment Study, or ACMS, that was released earlier this year contained another reaffirmation of some really disturbing evidence, information and trends. What types of strategies within Safe and Supported are picking up a prevention focus, and across the system, do we need to do more from preventative public health approach that will actually stop or impede the amount of children and families entering into the tertiary end of the spectrum and become a statistic that we report on within the statutory system itself? Go, Paul.
I'm happy to. We have to address poverty. God's sakes, can we finally get around to doing something about poverty, and the equitable distribution of wealth in this country? We're a wealthy nation, and the fact that so many children grow up in poverty is just absurd. We should be thoroughly embarrassed by it, but we still have a system that disproportionately directs its wealth to a very narrow portion of our society. We've got to do something about greater equity there. And I know that I'll start with that's a really easy thing. We should be able to knock that off, but no. So we have to do something about poverty. We have to do something about housing and the right to housing. And I know that that's a current conversation, so I'm not going to touch too much on that. But those are the sorts of things that increase involvement in the child protection system. We need to, and likewise, and I know this is a current conversation as well, but think differently about how we understand and support parents and families with disability. We've got to stop seeing disability as a risk and actually just start seeing it as a broader, recognizing our broader community obligation to support all parents, including making reasonable accommodations for parents in those circumstances and support them to understanding that different parents are going to need different supports. And that includes parents with disability. And we need to invest more in the sorts of treatment and services that currently have obscene waiting lists, and I know is a frustration for our practitioners out there, when they're doing things like trying to work with families experiencing addiction, and courts are saying, well, you've got a 2-year period to get your life together, but you've got a 2-year waiting list to get into an addiction treatment center. That'll be fantastic. So if we can do more to actually address and make those things accessible, change our conversations around the supports parents and families need. So there's more universal access to some of those supports. and we don't have people living in the stress of poverty, which we know undermines one's capacity to parent, then I think that's a big thing that will make a huge difference in this space. So seeing the well-being of our children as a collective responsibility and not a every man for himself responsibility, as I said.
Thanks, Paul. Helen, any quick observations or comments from you on that one?
Yeah, I think picking up on what Paul said, you know, the most children grow up safe and well, supported by family and parents and extended family and community. And I guess so it shouldn't be that hard for the small cohort who need extra assistance when the wobble hits, because the wobble hits for all of us as parents. You know, Jamie, you started with saying you're a parent, I'm a parent. All of us have a wobble. We all have different resources available to us to help us address those wobbles when the wobbles happen. And so I think for me, it's about saying, well, if people need help when they hit a wobble, we've got to actually have the right help in the right place. And it can't be that we have limited responses available to us. So I think that's where the prevention sits in, you know, that we can address those wobbles as they're coming and create less of a create more of a partnership approach to the way we work with families, and a more relationships-based approach, the way we work with families to help them keep their children safe at home. That would be my thought.
Thanks. And Tim, a final comment on that issue from you before we wrap up today's session.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. And we have to sort of stop the, I guess, for want of a better word, the flow into child protection systems. Like that's the critical bit, is providing the supports to help children and families not go into the child protection systems, to keep children and families safe and well. And I think it kind of goes back a little bit to the previous conversation or previous point we were discussing around the siloing and etc. Like, we have to be ensuring the access to the universal services, the preventative services, the early intervention services, and it can't just be from one portfolio. So we have to work across those portfolios, across those service boundaries to enable that. And I think that's the approach that we kind of need in order to be able to provide the supports that's required to help children and families not go into child protection systems and to keep children safe.
Thanks, Tim, and thank you to Paul, Helen and Tim for your contributions, insights and preparedness to talk about some of your own experiences and challenges through this process today. We can stop child abuse and neglect, and we can reduce its impact. And true, honest, respectful and strong relationships between First Nations organisations, government decision makers, actors and advocates within the sector, such as myself or the National Coalition, and most importantly, with families, children and young people themselves, will change the way that we work and will improve outcomes for families, children and young people, and support them to better meet their own aspirations, goals and life dreams. So I wanted to again thank everyone for their participation and sharing of experiences through the discussion today. I do acknowledge we didn't get to all of the questions, so my apologies to our webinar participants. There were a couple of questions in the chat that were asking for resources, such as where do I get a copy of the partnership agreement that people have spoken about? Is that resource that Helen referenced available anywhere? So with the delight of handballing to the NAPCAN team, because it's their show, they will put those links up on their website when the recordings go up later on. So we will try and close out a range of those issues. Today's...
I'll just jump in. Partnership agreement hasn't been agreed yet. It will be later in the year. Hopefully that will have it agreed, but once it is, we'll make sure that it's available.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And even a link to, which we all are aware of, but for quick reference, a link back to the CTG agreement and some other protocols that have been established supporting its implementation, I think some of our participants would find useful. This morning's webinar was the 4th or 5th in the great program that NAPCAN have put together for this week. So I just remind people that this afternoon there is a webinar on preventing emotional abuse of children and the role of parenting support. Tomorrow morning there's a webinar on Let's Hear from Young People and what's missing from education on relationships, consent and sex. So it's not too late to enrol in those webinars in particular, and you can review the webinar program on the NAPCAN Child Protection Week website that you would have been to register for this webinar as well. And on Friday, there is the Let's Get Our Words Right, how to craft messages that can support us to drive child abuse prevention and its messaging for greater impact. So thank you to NAPCAN, thank you to Paul, Helen and Tim. And because I can see that we're still being recorded, I'll note the absolute impartiality of our public servants on the call. NAPCAN is a yes organisation. Families Australia is a yes organisation. And I'll take the opportunity in closing to encourage everyone to vote yes in the upcoming referendum on a voice to Parliament. It is an important, simple and easy step that we can make as a nation to honour and recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in our constitution, which is the founding document of European settlement of this country. And it will make a practical difference to families, children and young people across the country, particularly First Nations families, children and young people. So if you do anything between now and the 14th, it's to convince 10 other people to vote yes. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you again to everyone for your involvement. And I do recognise that I've run 4 or 5 minutes over time, so apologies for that. Have a great week, everyone, and look out for the posting of the recording on the NAPCAN website in a couple of weeks. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.